The first lie tasted like copper and panic. Josie held the phone a few inches from her ear, the receiver already cool against her skin, and listened to the perfectly articulated silence on the other end of the line. She had just, with the buttery confidence of a seasoned professional, informed Mr. Alistair Wren's notoriously severe advisor that the caterer, the one booked 18 months in advance, the one whose Michelin stars were a matter of public record, had experienced a catastrophic kitchen fire. A total loss. Tragic, really. Such a shame about the heirloom copper pots. A fire, the voice on the other end, a man named Halloran whose tone suggested he was carved from glacial ice, finally repeated. It wasn't a question. It was a statement being held up to the light, examined for flaws. Josie pressed on, her own voice a smooth balm of competence over the frantic thumping in her chest. Devastating. The fire marshal is still on site. Obviously they are despondent, but more importantly, they are unavailable. And with the wedding only 3 weeks out? She let the sentence hang, a beautiful, terrible ornament of impossibility. This was the job. Not planning a wedding, but unplanning one, piece by piece, without the groom ever realizing the bride wasn't just late to the altar, but was currently halfway to Saskatchewan with a man who occasionally turned into a wolf. Halloran had been exquisitely, brutally clear. When he'd hired her 2 days ago in a hushed corner of a hotel bar that smelled of old leather and desperation. Mr. Wren is a man who values order above all else, he'd said, his pale eyes never blinking. The union with Serafina de Corville is a matter of significant social and political importance. Her sudden elopement presents a logistical inconvenience we must manage with discretion. Logistical inconvenience was a charmingly sterile term for the bride to be running off with her werewolf soulmate. Josie, who had once coordinated a society wedding during a Category 3 hurricane, merely nodded. The fee Halloran had quoted could have bought her a small island, or at least paid off the mortgage on her city apartment. The non-disclosure agreement she'd signed could have seen her imprisoned in a sub-basement for the rest of her natural life. The de Corville family is cooperating, Halloran had added, his voice dropping a further degree toward absolute zero. Serafina's mother has informed their circle that her daughter is at an exclusive wellness retreat in the Swiss Alps. Discreet. Invitation only. No phones. Their side is managed. He had paused, turning his glass of untouched whiskey a precise quarter turn. Mr. Wren does not maintain personal friendships. He will not hear from her directly. Your task is to manage the operational layer, the vendors, the timeline, the cascade of plausible delays. You will invent delays, Halloran had instructed. Plausible, escalating, and utterly insurmountable. You will be the face of every problem. The wedding must not happen on its scheduled date. It must be postponed, indefinitely if possible, until we can locate the bride and rectify the situation. Or until hell froze over, Josie thought. Whichever came first. Her job was to be a human shield of bad news, a curator of catastrophes. Find a new caterer, Halloran said now, his voice tight with controlled fury. It wasn't directed at her. It was directed at a runaway fiancé and, probably, the entire lycanthropic species. A comparable one, and make sure the process of selecting them is thorough. Of course, Josie said, the professional smile audible in her voice. I'll need to consult with Mr. Wren directly to understand his palate and preferences. I'll draw up a shortlist by morning and arrange a walkthrough at the estate for tomorrow afternoon. Another silence stretched. Josie could practically hear Halloran weighing the risks of letting her anywhere near his employer. But he was out of options. She was the firewall he had hired. Fine, he conceded. 2 o'clock. He is expecting you. And Miss Evans? Yes? Remember your purpose. You are a planner. A very, very good one. That is all you are. The line went dead. Josie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The air in her office, usually smelling of coffee and floral samples, suddenly felt thin. She looked at the file on her desk. Wren/de Corville. It was inches thick, bound in white leather, a monument to a wedding that would never happen. Inside were floor plans for a ballroom that seated 500, contracts for an orchestra that specialized in Viennese waltzes, and a photo of the happy couple. Serafina was blonde and dazzling, with the kind of effortless beauty that seemed both genetic and expensive. Ren was different. The photo was professional, polished, but it couldn't quite hide the stillness in his eyes. He was handsome in a severe, architectural way, all sharp angles and dark hair. But it was the look on his face that held her, a look of profound, ancient patience. The look of a man waiting for something to be over. Well, she thought, picking up her pen, he was about to have to wait a little bit longer. She started a fresh list on a yellow legal pad. Phase 1. The stall. 1. Caterer fire, complete. 2. Venue inspection/consultation with groom. 3. Shortlist of impossible-to-book replacements. 4. Protracted tasting schedule. She was a very, very good planner, and the plan, for now, was perfect. The only variable was him, the man with the patient eyes, waiting in his silent house for a wedding that was already a ghost. The Wren estate was less a house and more a geographic feature. It didn't sit on the landscape, it commanded it. A long, winding drive cut through acres of old-growth forest before the trees gave way to a severe, beautiful structure of dark gray stone and glass. It was old world in its bones, modern in its skin. There was a silence to the place that felt heavier than mere quiet. It was the silence of centuries. Josie's sensible sedan felt like a child's toy parked on the sprawling gravel forecourt. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, crisp black suit, hair pulled back in a severe chignon, lipstick the color of confidence. She was the embodiment of professional competence. She had to be. Halloran met her at the door. In person, he was even more imposing, tall and thin as a blade, his suit perfectly tailored. He moved with a quiet efficiency that made her skin prickle. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice the same low murmur as on the phone. "Mr. Wren is in the library." He led her through a cavernous entrance hall. The air inside was cool, still, and smelled faintly of old paper and ozone, like the moments before a storm. There were no family photos on the walls, no clutter on the gleaming mahogany tables. It felt less like a home and more like a museum, curated by someone with impeccable and severe taste. Every object looked priceless and untouched. The library was 2 stories high, walled with books from floor to ceiling. A rolling ladder leaned against one shelf, looking as if it hadn't been moved in 100 years. In the center of the room, standing before a vast, unlit fireplace, was Alistair Wren. The photograph hadn't done him justice, or rather, it had failed to capture the sheer weight of his presence. He was unnervingly still, not in a relaxed way, but in the way a predator is still before it moves. He wore simple black trousers and a dark gray cashmere sweater that did nothing to soften the sharp lines of his face. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, fixed on her as she entered. Afternoon light streamed through the tall library windows, catching the angles of his face, and he looked, for a moment, almost warm, almost alive. The patience she'd seen in the photo was there, but in person, it felt less like waiting and more like observing. "Mr. Wren," Halloran said, "this is Josephine Evans, the wedding planner I mentioned." Wren inclined his head, a small, spare movement. "Miss Evans?" His voice was low, resonant, with a strange, formal cadence that felt centuries out of date. It wasn't an accent, precisely. It was a precision of speech that no one had time for anymore. "Halloran informs me we are facing a culinary apocalypse." A flicker of dry humor. Josie hadn't expected that. It threw her off for a fraction of a second. She recovered, extending a hand. "Something like that, Mr. Wren. It's an unfortunate situation, but entirely manageable." He looked at her outstretched hand for a beat too long before taking it. His skin was cold. Not just cool, but cold, like marble that had been kept in a cellar. The contact sent a jolt up her arm, sharp and unpleasant and strangely intimate. He released her hand almost immediately. "Manage it, then," he said, turning his gaze to the empty fireplace. He didn't seem angry or distressed. He seemed bored, as if a fire at his caterer was on par with a misplaced newspaper. "That's why I'm here," Josie said, forcing her tone back to brisk efficiency. "To manage it effectively, I need to understand your and Serafina's preferences. The original file mentions a preference for classic French, but is there any flexibility? Any other cuisines you enjoy? It might open up our options." He was quiet for a moment. She had the distinct impression he was listening to something far away. "I do not enjoy cuisine, Miss Evans. I can eat, certainly, but it has had no taste for me in approximately 400 years. The food at these events is theater. Serafina enjoys whatever is fashionable." The casual mention of 400 years slid past Josie like a strange wind she couldn't quite place. The dismissal of his fiancée was so casual, so complete, it was almost more damning than an insult. He didn't care. He truly did not care. The knowledge settled in Josie's stomach like a stone. This man wasn't pining for his lost love. He was annoyed by a disruption to his schedule. "Right," Josie said, pulling a sleek tablet from her briefcase. "Well, fashionable we can do. I've prepared a preliminary list of replacements. It's a long shot on this short notice, but with the right leverage, I might be able to persuade one of them." She held out the tablet. He didn't take it. He simply looked at her, his gray eyes unnervingly direct. "You seem very capable, Miss Evans." "I am," she said, meeting his gaze. It was like looking into deep water. "That's why Mr. Halloran hired me." "Indeed." He turned to his advisor. "Halloran, see that Miss Evans has whatever she requires. Access to the grounds, the kitchens, the ballroom. I have work to attend to." And with that, he was gone, moving out of the room with a silence that was just as unsettling as his stillness. He didn't seem to walk so much as flow, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway without a sound. Josie stood there, tablet in hand, the chill of his handshake still lingering on her skin. Halloran's words echoed in her mind. "You are a planner. That is all you are." But as she looked around the vast, silent library, at the books that seemed to hold the dust of ages, she had the unnerving feeling that she had just agreed to a job far more complicated than simply stalling a wedding. She was a lie walking through a house of secrets, and the man at the center of it all was colder than the stone his house was built from. The second lie was more intricate, a delicate filigree of falsehood involving customs declarations and the particularities of 18th century French looms. The lace, Josie explained to Wren over the phone 2 days later, the specific, irreplaceable lace Serafina had insisted upon for draping the ballroom, was being held at an import facility in Le Havre. A paperwork issue. Infuriating, but these things happened.
"So, no lace," Wren's voice came back, flat and devoid of inflection.
"Not no lace," Josie corrected smoothly, pacing her small, sunlit office. "Just a delay in its arrival, which unfortunately pushes back the entire decor schedule. We can't hang the floral installations until the draping is complete." It was a beautiful, cascading sequence of dependencies, a masterpiece of project management bullshit. "I see," he said. There was a long pause. Josie heard the faint, rhythmic sound in the background, a soft thump-thump, thump-thump. It sounded like a heartbeat, but deeper, slower. "I assume you have a contingency." "Of course. I'd like to walk you through some alternative fabrics. There are some beautiful domestic silks that could work, though they would change the overall aesthetic. It's a decision you and Serafina should really make together." She let the bait hang. Every mention of the absent bride was a test. "Serafina trusts my judgment in matters of aesthetics," he said, the lie so smooth it could have been the truth. "And I trust yours. You are the expert." Another pause, longer this time. The rhythmic thumping stopped. "Come to the house, this afternoon. We can review the samples." It wasn't a request. Josie's stomach tightened. Every visit to that house felt like a risk, like stepping into a place where the normal rules of light and time didn't apply. But it was part of the job. Forcing proximity, creating shared tasks. It was the only way to make the stall feel collaborative instead of obstructive. When she arrived, Halloran was nowhere in sight. Wren met her at the door himself. He was dressed as before, in dark, simple clothes that seemed to absorb the light. Today she noticed the way he held himself, a perfect, balanced stillness that must have required incredible physical control. "Miss Evans," he said, stepping back to let her in. "Mr. Wren?" She stepped over the threshold, and the air changed. The warmth of the autumn afternoon was instantly replaced by the profound, cellar-like cool of the house. It was like stepping into another season. He led her not to the library, but to a smaller, more intimate drawing room. A fire was burning in the hearth, real wood, crackling and spitting. It was the first sign of genuine, messy life she'd seen in the entire estate. The warmth, however, didn't seem to reach the corners of the room. Josie laid her heavy sample books on a large oak table. "I brought a range of silks, velvets, and even some modern synthetics that mimic the feel of antique lace quite well." He didn't look at the books. He looked at her. "You seem to thrive on crisis, Miss Evans." "I thrive on solutions," she countered, opening a book to a page of shimmering ivory silk. She ran her hand over it. "This one has a beautiful weight. It would catch the candlelight magnificently." He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him. It was a tangible presence, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the room. She was acutely aware of the scent of his clothes, clean, like cold air and old paper, and the complete absence of any other scent. No cologne, no soap, not even the basic warm scent of a living person. Her own heart started beating a little faster, a stupid, involuntary reaction. He was a client, a very strange, very cold client. His gaze dropped to her hand on the silk, then to the fabric itself. "It is acceptable." "Acceptable?" Josie bristled slightly. "Mr. Wren, this is hand-woven silk from Como. It's what Italian princesses use for their wedding gowns. It's a bit more than acceptable." She hadn't meant for the passion to bleed into her voice. The genuine love for the texture and craft of it. A flicker of something, amusement, interest, crossed his face. It was there and gone in a second. "Your dedication to your craft is admirable." He reached out, not to touch the fabric, but to a loose thread on the edge of the sample book. He pinched it between his thumb and forefinger with a delicacy that seemed at odds with his severe presence. He didn't look at her, but she felt his attention on her like a physical weight. "How does one become a planner of weddings, Miss Evans? Did you dream of it as a child?" The question was so unexpected, so personal. It was a deviation from the script. "Not exactly," she said, her professional mask sliding back into place. "I like logistics. I like taking 100 chaotic elements and making them into one perfect day. It's satisfying." "A creator of perfect days," he mused, his voice low. He was still looking at the thread, turning it over and over. "It must be a considerable burden." "It's a job," she said, but the word felt flimsy. They spent another hour looking through the books. Or rather, she did. She talked about textures and light, about how a deep velvet would absorb the sound in the cavernous ballroom, creating a more intimate feel, while a satin would reflect it, making the orchestra sound brighter. She spoke of color theory, of the subtle difference between cream, ivory, and alabaster. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, watching her, his stillness a counterpoint to her animated energy. She was so caught up in the details, in the genuine pleasure of her work, that she almost forgot she was lying. She almost forgot that the lace wasn't stuck in customs, that the bride was gone, that this entire conversation was a beautifully constructed fraud. When she was done, he simply nodded. "This silk you first showed me, the one from Como. Order that." "But Serafina's lace," Josie began, remembering her role. "Serafina will have to content herself with the tears of Italian princesses," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Your choice is better." Josie packed up her sample books, her mind reeling. He was supposed to be annoyed, frustrated. He was supposed to argue, to demand she fix the lace situation. Instead, he seemed diverted, as if these small, manufactured crises were a welcome distraction. As she was leaving, he stopped her at the door. Miss Evans. Yes? The fire at the caterer's, he said, his gray eyes fixed on hers. Was anyone hurt? The question caught her completely off guard. In all her meticulous planning of the lie, she'd only focused on the logistical fallout. She'd never once considered the human element of her fiction. No, she said, the word feeling thick in her throat. No, thank goodness. It happened after hours. The kitchens were empty. He held her gaze for a long moment. Good, he said, and the single word held a universe of meaning she couldn't begin to decipher. She walked to her car, the cold of the house clinging to her suit. The lie was holding. The stall was working. But the clean, professional lines of the job were starting to blur, smudged by the unexpected humanity of a man who was not, she was beginning to suspect, entirely human at all. The tasting was, by any objective measure, a masterclass in awkwardness. It was also Josie's most brilliant and most perilous piece of stalling yet. After 2 weeks of vetting and negotiations, she had secured a new caterer, a rising star chef named Julian, who was notoriously difficult and brilliant in equal measure. Securing him had supposedly taken all of Josie's considerable powers of persuasion. Convincing him to prepare a full 8-course tasting menu on short notice was, she'd explained to Wren, a miracle of modern logistics. The miracle was currently laid out on a long table in the estate's formal dining room. The room, like the rest of the house, was magnificent and cold, dominated by a dark wood table that could comfortably seat 30. Today it was set for 2. Or, more accurately, for 1 and an observer. Wren sat opposite her, watching with that unnerving stillness as a server placed the first course in front of Josie, a delicate scallop crudo with citrus pearls and fennel foam. A plate was set before Wren as well, for appearances, but he made no move to touch it. Chef Julian's philosophy is built around the purity of the ingredient, Josie began, her voice echoing slightly in the vast room. She picked up her fork. This scallop was, and I quote, sleeping in the ocean this morning. Wren's eyes flickered to the dish, then back to her. And now it is sleeping in fennel foam, a less noble fate. Josie paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. There it was again, that dry, unexpected wit. Some might call it an apotheosis, she countered, and took a bite. The flavor exploded on her tongue. Clean, briny, bright. Oh, that's... wow. She closed her eyes for a second, genuinely lost in the sensation. That's incredible. The citrus cuts the richness perfectly. It's... bright. When she opened her eyes, he was watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the food. His focus was so absolute it felt like a touch. The professional patter died in her throat. She could hear the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. Describe it, he said, his voice a low command. I did. It's bright, clean. The texture of the scallop is silky, and the fennel has this tiny, crisp bite to it. No, he said, leaning forward slightly. The candlelight from the candelabra between them cast his face in sharp relief, deepening the shadows under his cheekbones. More specific, the temperature, the way the flavor changes after the first second. This was not in the plan. The plan was for her to taste, offer some professional platitudes, and stretch the process out for 3 hours. This was something else. This was intimate. She took another, more deliberate bite, trying to dissect the experience. It's cool on the tongue at first. The citrus is the first thing you taste, very sharp, like a little electric shock. Then the saltiness of the scallop comes through, a deeper, rounder flavor. It finishes with the anise of the fennel, which lingers. He listened, his head tilted slightly, as if he could taste the words themselves. He hadn't blinked. Josie wasn't sure she'd ever seen him blink. The courses continued like that. A velvety butternut squash soup with sage cream, a pan-seared duck breast with a cherry reduction, a complex earthy mushroom risotto. For each he would ask and she would describe. She found herself abandoning the bland professional language of a planner and reaching for more personal, sensory words. She talked about how the soup felt like wearing a warm blanket, how the duck's skin crackled with the sound of autumn leaves. She was performing, but the performance was becoming something real. She was sharing an experience with him, even though he couldn't partake in it. He couldn't taste the food, but he was tasting her reaction to it. The realization made her skin flush. During the risotto course, she found herself laughing. "This is absurd," she said, putting her fork down. "Me eating my way through a GDP-sized meal, and you just watching." "I am not just watching," he said. His gaze was heavy. "I am listening. It has been a very long time since I have heard someone describe the taste of anything with such attention." The way he said "a very long time" made the hairs on her arms stand up. She wasn't talking to a man who'd been on a diet. She was talking to someone for whom the simple, human pleasure of a meal was a distant, historical fact. The thought was profoundly lonely. "You don't eat," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I can," he said, his gaze steady on hers. "It simply passes without impression, like reading a book in a language you once spoke fluently but have long forgotten. The shapes are familiar, the meaning is gone." He moved his fork a quarter-inch to the left on his untouched plate, a precise, automatic gesture. "It has been this way for approximately 400 years. The blood sustains. Everything else is theater." "So all those society dinners, the charity galas, are an exercise in misdirection. I have become very skilled at moving food around a plate." The corner of his mouth tilted up. "It's one of the few practical skills one acquires over the years that remains consistently useful." She found herself smiling back. A real smile, not her professional one. "I can imagine." The server brought the dessert course. There were 2 options: a dense, dark chocolate torte and a light, airy lemon cake with lavender icing. "The torte is the obvious choice for a winter wedding," Josie said, her voice softer now. "It's rich, decadent, it's what everyone will expect." "And the lemon cake?" he asked. She looked at it. It was simple, elegant, dusted with powdered sugar. It looked like a happy memory. "The lemon cake," she said, her voice dropping, "is a surprise. It's unexpected. It tastes like the first day of spring." She took a bite. The tartness of the lemon, the floral hint of lavender, the sweetness of the icing. It was perfect. It was a clear, bright note at the end of a heavy meal. "It's the one," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's the only real choice." He didn't ask her to describe it this time. He just watched her face as she ate it, an expression in his own that she couldn't read. It wasn't boredom, not anymore. It was something closer to wonder. The meal ended. The staff cleared the plates. The fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers. Josie felt a strange reluctance to leave. The comfortable fiction they had built in that room felt more real than the truth waiting for her outside of it. "Julian is an artist," she said, stacking her notes. "We should book him. Immediately." Another lie. Julian was already booked, the contract signed and sealed a week ago. "Yes," Wren said, his eyes on the dying fire. "Do that." He seemed distracted, his thoughts elsewhere. He was looking at the flames, but Josie had the feeling he was seeing something else entirely. Something from a very, very long time ago. That night, Josie lay awake in her own apartment, the city lights painting stripes across her ceiling. She could still feel the intensity of his gaze, still hear the strange cadence of his voice. She had spent 3 hours lying to a man who couldn't eat, and in doing so, had shared a meal more intimate than any she'd ever had. The job was getting complicated, and her heart, the stupid, unprofessional, traitorous organ, was beating to a rhythm that felt dangerously close to his. The seating chart was a battlefield, and Josie was losing the war against her own composure. They were in the estate's ballroom, a vast, echoing space with ceilings so high they seemed to gather shadows. A dozen round tables were set up as mock-ups, and in the center, a massive blueprint of the room was spread across a temporary table, littered with little white cards, each bearing the name of a guest who would not be coming. This was the pretext for today's meeting, a final review of the guest arrangements. It was a task of excruciating, mind-numbing detail, perfect for eating up another precious afternoon. "The Barringtons cannot be seated next to the Lowells," Josie said, moving a card with a decisive tap of her finger. "Not after the unfortunate incident with the prize-winning poodle at last year's regatta. And Lady Annabel is recently separated from her husband, so we need to keep her away from any eligible bachelors. It's too soon." Wren stood beside her, leaning over the table. He was so close she could feel the chill of him through the sleeve of her blouse, a pocket of cold air in the cavernous room. He smelled of nothing, as always, that unnerving, clean absence of scent. She was painfully aware of the small sounds of her own body, the whisper of her clothes as she moved, the soft thud of her heart, a sound she was sure he could hear in the profound silence of the room. "This is a ridiculous process," he commented, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "It's called diplomacy," she countered, not looking at him. She focused on the name Seraphina de Courville on a card at the head table. The lie felt heavy and sour in her mouth. "It's the art of making 500 people feel like they're the most important person in the room, while simultaneously keeping them from killing each other. A skill I imagine has applications beyond weddings." She glanced up at him then. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held that familiar, disconcerting focus. "You have no idea." She reached for a card on the far side of the chart, leaning across the table. Her sleeve brushed against his hand. It was like touching a statue in winter, a shock of cold that was sharp and absolute. She flinched, pulling her arm back. He went perfectly, unnaturally still. His gaze dropped to her hand, then back to her face. For the first time, she saw something flicker in that placid facade, a tension, a tightening around his eyes. He didn't move, didn't breathe. She realized with a jolt that he wasn't breathing. He had simply stopped. In the silence, a thought arrived, clear and unwelcome. She was alone in a room with something that could kill her before she finished drawing her next breath. The vast, empty ballroom suddenly felt like a cage, and she was acutely, horribly aware of the sound of her own blood moving through her veins, the warmth radiating from her skin like a signal fire. For 3 terrible seconds, every ancient animal instinct in her body screamed at her to run. She didn't run. She stayed exactly where she was, her hand still hovering over the seating chart, and she didn't know if that made her brave or profoundly stupid. The moment stretched, thin and humming with a strange energy. The air between them felt charged. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, every echo dying away until all she could hear was the frantic, stupid drumming of her own blood. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He seemed to force himself into motion. He took a step back, putting a careful foot of distance between them. He drew in a slow, deliberate breath, though it seemed more like a conscious act of mimicry than a physical need. "I am fine," he said. The words were clipped. "You are warm." "I'm alive," she replied without thinking. "Most of us are." The words hung between them, heavier than she'd intended. Warmth wasn't just temperature. It was mortality. It was the thing he didn't have, and the thing, she suspected, that drew him. The thing that made her pulse interesting, and her descriptions of food something worth leaning forward for. The corner of his mouth twitched. A fortunate condition. He looked away from her, his gaze sweeping over the empty ballroom. "This room has seen 3 weddings. Mine will be the 4th. You don't sound very excited about it." The words were out before she could stop them. It was unprofessional, a line she should never have crossed. He turned back to her, and the guarded neutrality was gone from his face. In its place was a weariness so profound it seemed to sink into his bones. It was the weariness of ages. "Excitement is a loud emotion, Miss Evans. I have come to prefer the quiet." "And Seraphina?" she pushed, hating herself for it, hating Halloran for putting her in this position. "Is she a quiet person?" A long silence. He looked at the little white card with her name on it. "Seraphina is the opposite of quiet," he said, and for the first time, Josie heard something real in his voice. Not love, not affection, just a flat, factual acknowledgement. A statement of incompatibility as clear as a chemical equation. He was lonely. The realization hit Josie with the force of a physical blow. This man, surrounded by wealth and history and power, was utterly, completely alone. And she, with her intricate lies and her manufactured crises, was the most consistent human contact he'd had in weeks. Her deception was a strange, twisted form of company. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to confess, to sweep the little white cards off the table and tell him the truth. She's gone. She's not coming back. This is all a sham. But she thought of the NDA, of Halloran's glacial eyes, of the paycheck that would change her life. So she swallowed the truth and pointed to the chart. "I think," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "we should put the ambassador from Genovia at table 7. He'll appreciate the view of the gardens." Wren looked at her, his eyes searching her face. He knew something was wrong. He didn't know what, but he knew. He could feel the lie, she suspected, the same way he could feel the warmth of her skin. "As you think best, Miss Evans," he said, his voice once again a mask of polite indifference. "You are the expert, after all." He stepped away from the table, walking towards the tall windows that overlooked the manicured lawns. He stood with his back to her, a solitary figure framed against the fading afternoon light. The distance between them was no longer just a few feet of empty space. It was a chasm of unspoken truths. Josie looked down at the seating chart, at the names of people who represented alliances and treaties, fortunes and histories. And in the middle of it all were two names, Wren and Serafina, linked by a duty that had nothing to do with love. She reached out and moved her own placeholder card, a small blue one she used for herself, a little closer to his. A small, foolish, and utterly pointless gesture of solidarity. The lies were becoming a tangled web, and Josie was the spider and the fly all at once. Her latest fabrication was a work of art. A structural engineer, a friend of a friend, had expressed grave concerns about the ballroom subflooring. The weight of 500 dancing guests, the orchestra, the massive floral installations, it could be a disaster. An inspection was required. A late-night inspection, naturally, as the engineer was booked solid. It was, of course, a complete fiction. There was no engineer. There was only Josie, letting herself into the silent estate with the key Halloran had given her, her heels clicking with absurd volume on the marble floor of the entrance hall. It was just after 11. The house was dark, the air thick with the accumulated quiet of the night. Her plan was simple. Spend an hour in the ballroom, take some pictures on her phone of the floor, and write a damning report that would necessitate a further, more invasive and time-consuming inspection. It was a solid, dependable lie. But the house pulled at her. The silence wasn't empty, it was watchful. She found herself drawn not towards the ballroom, but down the hallway towards the library, towards his part of the house. The door to his study, a room she'd never been in, was slightly ajar, a thin slice of warm golden light cutting through the oppressive darkness of the corridor. Curiosity, that fatal human flaw, got the better of her. She moved toward the door, her hand already reaching for it, when a voice came from inside. "You may come in, Miss Evans." His tone was unhurried, unsurprised. "I heard your car on the gravel." She pushed the door open. The room was lined with older books than the main library, their leather spines cracked and worn. A massive, globe-like map from the 17th century stood in one corner. The air smelled of wood smoke from the embers dying in the fireplace, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. Wren was sunk into a deep leather armchair, not asleep, but in something deeper and stranger. A deep, meditative stillness, a voluntary dimming of the senses. It was the closest thing to rest his kind could manage. Not sleep, but a quieting, a partial surrender. As she watched, he reached to the table beside him and lifted something to his lips. A plastic pouch, the kind used for medical transfusions, filled with a dark, viscous red liquid. A thin, clear tube ran from the pouch to his mouth. He took one final, deliberate sip, holding her gaze the entire time, then set the pouch down on the table with a quiet thud. He had known she was coming. He had heard her, and he hadn't hidden. Josie's mind, usually a whirring machine of logistics and solutions, went completely, utterly blank. The world narrowed to that one impossible image. Alastair Wren, in his ancient, silent house, drinking blood from what looked for all the world like a grown-up Gothic Capri Sun. Her body understood before her mind did. Every muscle locked. A cold, primal current ran down her spine, the ancient animal recognition of a predator in the room. The study suddenly felt very small and very old, and she was acutely, horribly aware of the sound of her own blood moving through her veins, the heat of it, the life of it. For 3 terrible seconds, she wanted to run more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. But he didn't move. He sat in his chair, the empty blood bag on the table beside him, and he looked at her with an expression she recognized. It was the same look he'd worn in the photograph. The look of a man waiting for something to be over. He was waiting for her to run. He expected it. And that expectation, that weary, practiced resignation, the resignation of a man who had watched people flee from him for nearly 5 centuries, broke something in her chest. Her mouth, disconnected from the frantic scramble of her thoughts, chose that precise moment to speak. "Is that," she asked, her voice a strange, high-pitched squeak, "a Capri Sun full of blood?" Of all the things she could have said, screamed, fainted, run, that was what came out. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the question hung in the air between them. Alastair Wren looked at the blood bag in his hand. He looked back at her. And then, the most impossible thing of all happened. A genuine, undeniable smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing centuries of stillness in an instant. It was a smile of pure, surprised amusement. He let out a low chuckle. It was a rusty sound, as if the mechanism for it hadn't been used in a very long time. "I have been alive for 472 years, he said, his voice laced with a strange, wondering humor. And no one has ever asked me that question. 472 years. The number landed in Josie's brain and detonated. The blood bag, the cold skin, the unnatural stillness, the way he never ate, the way he spoke as if he'd learned English from Shakespeare himself, the profound loneliness in his eyes. All the disparate, unsettling pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, undeniable logic. Vampire. The word wasn't a scream in her head, it was a quiet, stunned whisper. Her carefully constructed world of lies, the caterer, the lace, the structural integrity of the ballroom floor, all of it felt laughably small, pathetically mundane in the face of this reality. Her biggest secret was that the bride had run away. His was that he drank blood to survive and was older than the United States of America. She should have been terrified. Part of her still was. Her hands were trembling, and her pulse hammered so loudly in her ears she was sure he could hear it across the room. But the terror was tangled up with something else, something stubborn and irrational. He had let her see. After 472 years, you don't accidentally leave your door open. He had invited her in, had taken that last sip while looking directly at her. It was either a threat or a confession, and the weariness on his face told her which. "It's from a blood bank," he said, his voice calm and even, as if he were discussing the weather. "Donated, screened, ethically sourced, if such a term can be applied." He gestured to the pouch on the table. "Think of it as a dietary supplement." "A dietary supplement," Josie repeated, her voice faint. "You're a vampire who drinks ethically sourced blood from a medical pouch, and you're calling it a dietary supplement?" "I find that euphemism is one of the great comforts of modern civilization." The corner of his mouth tilted again. "Sit down, Miss Evans, before you fall down." She walked stiffly to the chair opposite his, her legs feeling disconnected from her body. She sat on the edge of the cushion, her hands clenched in her lap. The fire had burned down to a soft red glow, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. He watched her, his gray eyes patient. He was waiting. For the screaming, the running, the hysterics. He'd seen it all before, she realized. In his 472 years, he must have. But Josie didn't scream. She took a deep, shaky breath, and the truth came spilling out. Serafina is gone. The words fell into the quiet room, small and hard and ugly. Ren's expression didn't change. He remained perfectly still, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. Gone where? She ran off, 3 weeks ago, with a man named Antoine. I believe, Josie added, the detail feeling both crucial and insane, that he is a werewolf. A beat of silence. Then Ren closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose. A long, slow breath that seemed to carry the weight of several centuries of exhaustion. A werewolf, he said. Of course. There's a certain poetic absurdity to it. He opened his eyes. The wolves and my kind have maintained a mutual tolerance for the better part of 3 centuries. We do not interfere in each other's affairs. It is an arrangement built on the understanding that we are both, fundamentally, predators who prefer not to share hunting grounds. The ghost of a smile, devoid of warmth. Serafina eloping with one is less a betrayal and more a territorial violation. Halloran would have seen it that way. It explains his panic. Halloran knew, Josie continued, the words coming faster now, a torrent of confession. He knew the day it happened. The wedding, the alliance, it was too important to just cancel. The de Corville family would be humiliated. There would be political fallout. He thought it would be better to manage the situation quietly, to find her and bring her back before anyone knew. She finally looked up at him, her eyes pleading for, she didn't know what, understanding? Forgiveness? He hired me, she whispered. My job was to stall. The caterer, the lace, the floor, all of it was a lie. I was hired to lie to you, to create delays until Halloran could fix it. She finished, her chest heaving, the silence rushing back in to fill the space her confession had carved out. She had laid all her cards on the table, the entire sordid, ridiculous truth. She braced herself for the explosion, for the fury of a man, an ancient, powerful vampire who had been made a fool of. But the fury never came. Ren leaned his head back against the worn leather of his chair and closed his eyes. That long, slow breath again, a sound of weariness so profound it seemed to come from the very dawn of time. When he opened his eyes, there was no surprise in them. None at all. I knew the caterer's fire was a fabrication by the second day, he said, his voice quiet. Copper pots do not melt in kitchen fires, Miss Evans. They warp. Josie stared at him. You knew? I suspected from the beginning. I confirmed it with a single phone call. He tilted his head, studying her. The lace in Le Havre was a particularly creative touch. I almost admired it. The room seemed to tilt. Then why? She breathed. Why didn't you say anything? Why did you let me? Because your visits were the first interesting thing to happen in this house in 11 years. The words were simple, devastating, and utterly without self-pity. A statement of fact from a man who had centuries of facts to draw from. I did not know what Halloran was managing, or why. I simply knew that a very warm, very alive woman was arriving at my door every few days with an increasingly absurd crisis and a genuine passion for Italian silk. I chose not to investigate the reason too closely. It was... He paused, searching for the word. Pleasant. Josie felt the tears prick her eyes before she could stop them. He had known. He had been lonely enough, starved enough for company, to let a stranger lie to him just so she'd keep coming back. The entire affair, he said, his voice hardening, has been a farce. Conducted by my most trusted advisor and his very capable planner. The way he said capable was like a shard of ice in her gut. The humiliation is not in being left by a woman I was contracted to marry, he continued, his gaze fixed on the dying fire. The humiliation is in the conspiracy. That my own people, the people who are meant to protect my interests, would choose to manage me with children's games rather than afford me the basic dignity of the truth. He turned back to her, and his face was a mask of cold, regal fury. But it wasn't for her. It was for Halloran, for the betrayal of trust. "I am so sorry," she said, the words inadequate. "Are you?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Are you sorry for the lie, Miss Evans? Or are you sorry you were caught?" "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick, "that I did it at all. And I'm sorry that the reason you let it continue is worse than the lie itself." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the ice. He hadn't expected her to understand that. She could see it in the way his stillness faltered, just for a moment.
"Your services," he said, his voice dropping, becoming formal and final, "are no longer required. You will send your final invoice to Halloran. He will see that you are paid in full, including a premium for your silence." It was a dismissal, absolute and complete. The job was over. The lie was over. And whatever strange, fragile connection had been growing between them in the spaces between the lies was severed. "Mr. Wren, Alistair," she started. "Leave," he said. The word was not loud, but it had the force of a physical blow. It echoed in the silent room, the final, closing note of their strange, shared story. Josie stood up, her legs unsteady. She walked out of the study, out of the library, through the vast, cold entrance hall. She didn't look back. She could feel his eyes on her, a cold weight on her shoulders all the way to the front door. She stepped outside, and the night air, cool and damp, felt shockingly warm against her skin. The silence was the worst part. After 3 weeks of frantic, high-stakes improvisation, of constant communication and escalating lies, there was nothing. Her phone didn't ring, her inbox remained empty. The vast, complicated machinery of the Rondecourville wedding had ground to a halt. The job was over. Josie's apartment, usually her sanctuary, felt like a cage. The silence was thick with unspoken words, with the echoes of his low, formal voice, and the memory of his surprising, rusty laugh. She went through the motions of her life, fielding calls from other clients, reviewing contracts, sketching out timelines for happier, more honest weddings. But it all felt flat, gray. The color had gone out of her work. She had been paid, as promised. A wire transfer had appeared in her account 2 days after her confession, for an amount that made her gasp. It was more than the agreed-upon fee. It was hush money. It was a final, dismissive severing of ties. The transaction felt cold and dirty. She should have been relieved. She was free. She had succeeded in a way. The wedding was off. She had her money. She was safe. But she felt hollowed out, haunted by the look in his eyes when she'd told him the truth. Not the anger, the moment before it, the quiet, crushing admission. "Your visits were the first interesting thing to happen in this house in 11 years. He had opened a door for her, literally and figuratively, and she had walked through it carrying nothing but lies. She sat down at her kitchen table one evening, a week after her dismissal, the city lights glittering coldly outside her window. She pulled out a sheet of heavy cream-colored stationery, the kind reserved for the most important of thank-you notes, and an old fountain pen. A digital apology wouldn't do. This required ink. It required effort. She started writing, and the words came not from the professional planner, but from the woman who had described the taste of lemon cake to a lonely man in a cavernous dining room. "Mr. Wren," she began, then crossed it out. "Alistair, I am writing to you because my apology the other night was insufficient. It was the apology of someone caught, and it was selfish. I want to offer you a real one, with no expectation that you will accept it. I am not sorry I was hired. It was a job, and I took it. I am not even, in some professional detached part of my brain, sorry for the lies themselves. They were, if I may say so, very good lies, the work of a craftsman. What I am sorry for is the intimacy I stole while telling them. I am sorry for the moments that felt real, because for me, they were. I am sorry that I got to know you under the most profoundly false of pretenses. I am sorry that I started to look forward to our meetings, to the sound of your voice, to the challenge of making you almost smile.
I am sorry that I used my professional skill to build a space where I could feel something for my client, all while deceiving him. The job was to stall. But somewhere along the way, in between the fictional fires and the non-existent customs delays, I stopped just doing my job. I started to care about the outcome. Not for the wedding, but for you. That is the betrayal for which I am truly, deeply sorry. It was a violation far worse than any lie about catering. I know now what you are. I know it should terrify me, and it did, for about 3 seconds, until I saw the look on your face. The look of a man who has watched people run from him for 5 centuries and has stopped being surprised by it. That look terrified me more than the blood ever could. You said my visits were the first interesting thing to happen in that house in 11 years. You let a stranger lie to you because the alternative was silence. I cannot fix what I did. But I can tell you that the woman who sat across from you at that dining table, who talked too much about Italian silk and argued with you about the word acceptable, she was not performing. She was the most honest version of me there is. I do not expect a reply. I just wanted you to have a truth from me that wasn't delivered in a moment of panic, one that I chose to give you. You deserved a planner who was just a planner. I am sorry that I was not her. Sincerely, Josephine Evans. She read it over. It was raw, honest, and professionally suicidal. It confessed not just to the lie, but to the feeling. It was the most unprofessional thing she had ever written. She folded the single sheet, slipped it into a matching envelope, and sealed it. She didn't trust the mail. She paid a bonded courier an exorbitant fee to deliver it directly to the estate the next morning. Then she waited. The silence returned, heavier than before. She told herself it was done. She had said her piece. It was a final act of penance. She expected nothing. It was better that way. Expecting nothing meant she couldn't be disappointed. But her heart, that stupid, traitorous organ, kept listening for the phone, hoping for a reprieve she knew she hadn't earned. Days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last, filled with the dull ache of silence. Josie threw herself into her work, planning a spring wedding for a disgustingly happy couple who couldn't keep their hands off each other. It felt like a punishment. She organized floral arrangements, debated the merits of salmon versus beef, and smiled her professional smile until her face ached. She didn't hear from Halloran. She didn't hear from Wren. The world of the estate had sealed itself off again, as if it had never existed. It was, she thought with a pang of familiar loneliness, what his life must be like all the time. Long stretches of quiet, punctuated by brief, disruptive intrusions from the mortal world. She was in the middle of a tense negotiation with a lighting technician, a man who believed fuchsia uplighting was the height of sophistication, when her personal cell phone rang. It was an unknown number, no caller ID. Usually she'd ignore it, but something made her answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice cautious. A pause. Then a voice she would recognize anywhere. A voice that seemed to carry the weight of centuries in its low, resonant timbre. Miss Evans. Her heart didn't just leap. It stopped dead for a full second before starting again with a painful, frantic thud. She turned her back on the lighting guy, walking to the far corner of the venue. "Alistair," she breathed, the name a prayer and a curse. "I received your letter," he said. There was no warmth in his tone, no forgiveness. It was the same measured, formal voice he'd used in their first meeting. "Oh," she said, her mind blank. "It was—" He paused, as if searching for a word he hadn't used in a century. "Illuminating. And irritatingly well written." Josie let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pressed her hand over her mouth. "I have one question for you," he said finally. "Anything," she whispered. His voice was very quiet, very precise. "The lemon cake, with the lavender icing. During the tasting," he paused. "When you said it was the only real choice, were you stalling, or did you mean it?" The question was so unexpected, so specific, it knocked the air from her lungs.
Of all the things he could have asked, all the accusations he could have leveled, he asked about the cake. He was asking about the one moment in all her performance where she had been completely, utterly, and forgetfully herself. The moment she had described not the food, but the feeling. Her throat felt tight. "I meant it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It tasted like hope." Another silence, longer this time. So long she thought he might have hung up. She could picture him on the other end of the line, standing in his dark, silent house, considering her answer, weighing its truth. Then he spoke, and his voice, for the first time, held a trace of something other than weariness or formality. It held a flicker of the same surprised humor she'd heard in his study. "Good," he said. The word was soft, but it landed with the force of a pardon. He took a breath, a deliberate, chosen breath, one he didn't need but took anyway, and she understood now that when he breathed, it was for her benefit, a small act of translation between his world and hers. "The wedding is cancelled, of course. The de Courvilles and I have come to a new arrangement." He paused, and the dry wit returned, a welcome, familiar ghost. "It transpires that Antoine's father is the Marchetti Pack Alpha. The Marchetti territory borders de Courville holdings in Provence. Serafina's mother, once she recovered from the indignity, realized the alliance was actually more advantageous than ours. Wolves are territorial. Vampires are patient. Between the two, the de Courvilles now have both a shield and a sword. A beat. I was, it seems, the less strategic match. One adjusts." "I see," Josie said, a real smile touching her lips despite the ache in her chest. "However," he continued, "the cancellation has left me with a number of loose ends, and a distinct and rather novel craving." Josie held her breath. "I find myself in need of a lemon cake," Alistair Wren said, and she could hear the smile in his voice now, that rare, rusty, beautiful sound. "Perhaps you'd be available to consult?" It wasn't a job offer. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. It was a beginning, a small, cautious, honest start. It was a choice made not under the cover of lies, but in the clear, bright light of the truth. "I think," Josie said, her heart so full it felt like it might burst, "I can fit that into my schedule." "Saturday," he said, 7 o'clock. The drawing room, not the dining room. I'll have the fire lit." "The fire," she repeated. "For atmosphere?" "For warmth," he said. "You seem to be perpetually warm, Miss Evans, and I have come to find that I would rather not be the reason you are cold." She closed her eyes. The lighting technician was staring at her from across the room, baffled and annoyed. She couldn't have cared less. "Alistair?" "Yes?" "You can call me Josie." A pause. The longest one yet. And then, very quietly, as if he were testing the shape of it, learning it. "Josie." Her name in his mouth sounded like something ancient and new all at once, like a word he intended to keep. "Saturday," she said. "I'll bring the cake." "Bring yourself," he replied. "That is the more essential ingredient." The line went quiet, and she stood there in the half-decorated venue, surrounded by fuchsia uplighting samples and a very confused technician, grinning like an idiot. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the warmth. He was a vampire. He was older than the country she lived in. He drank blood from medical pouches and hadn't tasted food in 4 centuries. But he had let her see. He had let a stranger's lies fill his silent house because the sound of her voice was better than the quiet. And now he was asking her to come back, not as a planner, not as a liar, but as herself. She thought about time, about what it meant to build something with a man who had centuries of it, when she had decades at best. The math was impossible. The logistics were, frankly, a nightmare. And Josie had always loved a logistical challenge. Somewhere, in the back of her mind, a thought surfaced. Quiet, unformed, more feeling than language. Not a decision, not yet, but an awareness. A door she hadn't known existed, standing slightly ajar, with cold air and old paper and forever on the other side of it. She didn't walk through it.
She didn't even look at it directly, but she knew it was there. And she knew, with the same certainty she'd felt when the lemon cake had touched her tongue, that it was the only real choice. She picked up her bag, smiled at the bewildered lighting technician, and walked out into the autumn evening. The air was crisp and bright, and for the first time in weeks, the city didn't feel gray. It felt like the first day of something. She had a cake to find, and a Saturday to plan for. And Josie Evans was, after all, a very, very good planner.